You're listening to Music Tectonics.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Music Tectonics, the podcast that goes beneath the surface of music and tech. I'm your host today, Tristra Newyear Year, Chief Strategy Officer at Rock Paper Scissors, the music tech and innovation PR firm. Today's episode leaps into the wonderfully sci-fi world of quantum music, except everything we will discuss today is actually real, so not that sci-fi. Or wait, is it both real and unreal at the same time? Anyway, our guest is Spencer Topel, who will give us a whirlwind tour of one of the most thrilling, odd, and bleeding edge areas in music tech today. Topel is an American artist known for his work in music composition, sound art, instrument design, and technology. After studying music composition at Juilliard and Cornell, Topel became a professor of music at Dartmouth. Topel's work and performances have been presented at amazing institutions like MoMA, the Weissman Art Museum in Minnesota, the Barnes Foundation, and Lincoln Center. His work has been performed by renowned ensembles like the Minnesota Orchestra, the Juilliard Symphony, and the Flux Quartet. In 2019, Topel founded Physical Synthesis, a company dedicated to developing new kinds of sound devices and products. And definitely look back for our past episode where we talk for a moment with Topel about some of the things he's up to with Physical Synthesis, one of our cool episodes where we talked about neat stuff we saw at NAMM. Anyway, Topel's latest artistic endeavors revolve around quantum computing technologies as they apply to music and sound synthesis. First, he had a residency at the Yale Quantum Institute, where he and his team created the world's first musical synthesizer using qubits. And we'll find out what those are in just a second. And more recently, Topel had an artist residency at Virginia Tech in 2022. Thank you so much, Spencer, for volunteering to introduce us to this interesting new world of quantum music.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Quantum computers are still not a thing yet.
Oh, yeah?
No.
But everyone acts like IBM keeps sending out these great press releases that they are. So what is, in principle, if quantum computers were to exist, what are they?
So quantum computers are devices that use something called a qubit. And a qubit is a quantum bit. So if we think about bits, most of us who have encountered a computer know that bits flip kind of values between 0 and 1. That's how they flip. So byte 0, byte 1. A quantum computer would use qubits, which allow you to have basically bits in superposition, meaning in a range of values of probabilities. So imagine now that for every bit that you have, you can compute not 2 states, but 3 states or more. So this ends up being a really powerful tool to compute things. And another really key part of a quantum computer that's different than a classical computer is that your bits, your qubits, can be entangled, meaning one affects another, affects another, affects another, and they all affect each other. And this is important because there are certain applications like machine learning where you have neural networks, and the neural networks need to affect each other. And so in a quantum system, like a quantum computer, those bits would then be able to produce more complex, richer calculations.
So I have a quick question. So with qubits, is it sort of like the Schrodinger's cat problem that we don't really know what position they're in? And once you get into even the complexities of entanglement, how do you know what's connected to what? Are people trying to still sort this out, or can you give us any sort of overview of that problem?
Well, there's a great intuition here, which we can draw on, which is musical. It's sound.
Amazing.
So in a way, the Schrodinger's equation describes a wave. It's a wave equation. And it's very much related to a standing wave of a string. So the way a string vibrates, the waves bounce back and forth. And that's effectively the model that we use to define states of electrons, excited state, ground state, etc. So that's a very musical thing. So in a way, it's kind of like instead of a classical computer where you have like fixed, voltage values for like high and low, you now have this soup of values that are fluctuating and changing like a vibrating string. And that's kind of very interesting and very intuitive musically. on the subject of entanglement, which is a really weird idea.
But it's super cool, right? It's one of those ideas that has this poetry to it, and I think a lot of people have run with it maybe in the too poetical direction. But what's the practical side of it?
Well, the practical side of it is that, entanglement between two photons or energy packets, these kind of subatomic particle elements, these energy packets, the basic idea is that they want to entangle to anything. So, in any given system, there's entanglement happening, like in a solid object or a mass. There's entanglement between all the energy states that are in that object. Now, when you talk about things like entangling two electrons that are isolated and at a distance, and this is this idea that Einstein referred to as spooky action at a distance, meaning two electrons can be entangled no matter how far apart they are. And recently there was a really interesting experiment out of ETH Zurich that really kind of attempted to definitively prove that entanglement exists and can be measured. And what they did was they set up two qubits at a distance. I think it was like 27 meters apart or something quite ridiculous, and basically built a gigantic dilution refrigerator, big, cold, empty, void vacuum system. And they used a laser to flip one of the qubits on the other side, and then they sent another message when it flipped again. And what they were interested in seeing was, would the other qubit flip with the other one? Were they entangled? So the first thing they did was they entangled the qubits. And then the second was, I'll just send a message. And if we flip that bit quick enough, this one, would the other qubit flip with it? Cool. And it did. And they measured that over and over and over again. So they kind of there's been a bunch of these experiments that have shown that entanglement exists. This is the one that is kind of like bulletproof. Yeah. It rules out as many other possible conditions as possible. So one thing to think about in terms of computing, which makes quantum computing very hard, is the problem that these electrons want to entangle with various things. So it could be something in the environment, it could be a space ray, it could be anything that could touch it. And so as a result, it's very hard to isolate these systems. And again, that we have a musical analogy there, which I love, which is signal to noise ratio, or the noise floor. When we talk about recording, we have to kind of set our microphone levels to deal with the noise floor. Well, there's a quantum noise floor, and you're kind of accounting for that as you build these experiments and these systems. And a big part of what people are trying to solve to get to a working quantum computer idea of decoherence. How fast is your system going to destabilize or entangle with something else or devolve into randomness? And,
randomness has its own uses, but it sounds like everything could be, there's still a lot to work with in order to make this a quote, a machine that we might be able to apply in specific and predictable ways. That said, I love how you've drawn all these parallels with music, and people are already using some of these quantum computing capabilities or theories to create new ways of making music, new approaches to music. Can you give us a quick snapshot of some of those experiments and thoughts?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just back up a second and say,
please,
where this started for me was it was somewhat random.
You got entangled. Did you get entangled?
No, definitely. So what had happened was I received an email. It was in the kind of a point in my personal life when we were transitioning. My wife had moved back to New York, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next. I got this email from Yale Quantum Institute from this guy named Florian Carli. And it said, hey, we want you to be our artist in residence at the Yale Quantum Institute. And I just sort of disregarded it. It's like, I was like, who does this? And I don't have time for this. I have other things I'm working on. And then I got a phone call a few weeks later, 3 weeks later. And it was this guy, Florian, and he said, hey, I tried to email you. We want to talk to you. And then I found out that they had funding and they really wanted to do this and they wanted to bring me down for years in residence. So I said, sure, I'll come down. I don't know anything about a quantum computer, what you're working on. I really had to, it was a steep learning curve to get in even quantum mechanics as it relates to the quantum engineering. So in any case, I went down there and I showed them what I was working on, which is this instrument called Cicada, which is related back to physical synthesis. And I said, here's what we're doing. And a couple of grad students came up immediately, Luke Burkhardt and Kyle Cerniak. And they said, hey, this is really cool. This very much relates to kind of things we're thinking about in the quantum domain. And that's sort of how it started. And so over the course of a year at Yale, at this amazing project where I get to work with these amazing scientists, Rob Shulkoff and Michel Devereux and their grad students, really, look at the application side of quantum computing. And my first inclination, I think, was to go back to the beginning of sound synthesis and say, how, if you look at, the early musical instruments, this is like the teleharmonium and eventually the Moog synthesizer. And, they were exploiting the kind of a magic of the transistor to make music. And a qubit in that sense is kind of primitive still, and it's very much like a transistor, but in this quantum transistor, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, that makes tons of sense.
Yeah, so my thinking is like, let's just use this qubit as it is, as a synthesizer, and let's figure out how to drive it and control it and manipulate it. And so that became an album that we produced called Quantum Sound, which is on all the different platforms, Spotify, Apple, etc. You can go take a look. And I think a key decision I made early on was I didn't want to make this album necessarily about myself. I wanted it to be collaborative. And so the two grad students I mentioned earlier, Kyle and Luke, I brought them as musicians. And so we effectively formed a laptop ensemble where they would participate and perform with me. And the advantage this gave us was they have a deep knowledge of their systems, about the intuition. I mean, it's one thing to know how to program something. It's another thing to know why that program matters and why it creates amazing things. And so they were able to give me insights into what kind of instruments we could build. So, for example, we built a 4-state, kind of state following synth called 4-state. Physical is really complicated. And what it did was it used kind of the logical jumps that were being observed in the data to control notes or pitch changes or rhythm changes, whatever have you. And then we modulated that against the quantum noise floor so you could actually hear it. So that was an important part of it, is really tying in the actual signal to the controls. So that was kind of like the bulk, the heart of this project. This past year, I was a composer named Riko Yamada reached out, and she said, hey, we're doing this symposium at ICFO in Spain called Quantum Sounds. I was like, well, that's a good name. I like it. And it turned out to be this amazing thing that happened in Spain this past summer in June. It was an invite-only conference. And that was largely kind of precipitated by this book project that was led by Eduardo Miranda, amazing composer and kind of visionary person. I've really grown to appreciate him and love his energy.
Did he have a video that featured him sort of controlling a system using these like really cool like ring devices and some other cool? Okay, so that was the first video I ever saw about quantum music, and we should definitely link to it in the show notes because it's striking.
But Eduardo has been for the last several years working on things relating to quantum, and there's kind of really two kind of trajectories for music, and I think this is really pertinent to the audience. There's the synthesis side and sonification side, which is really what I was interested in 2019 onward. And there's another side, which is simulation and information side. And there's some amazing work out of this quantum computing company called Quantinium, and their lead scientist or chief scientist, Bob Koecki, has worked a lot on language semantics and quantum models. And that was effectively how Eduardo Miranda became connected to that whole world, was through Bob. And as a result, there's all this amazing work coming out relating to the idea of composition, like more traditional music composition as well. So you kind of see this world emerging of activity. Maybe the third area is called simulation. And that's something I've become quite interested in. There was, after we released Quantum Sound, this young artist / scientist, he's actually a mathematician and now a co-author for a project named Parker Kuklinski, reached out to me. He actually reached out to Yale and said, hey, I want to work with you guys. You're doing Quantum Sound. I've been looking at sonification of quantum carpets, which is a mathematical phenomenon. And so I talked to Parker and we hit it off right away. And as part of a Virginia Tech residency that I did in 2022, because it was delayed by a couple of years because of COVID.
Yeah.
Virginia Tech had this I4 conference led by Eric Lyon. And so he brought all these artists. He kind of wanted to kind of create a, Black Mountain College experience for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have a huge multi-array speaker system. And so I was able to take the simulation that Parker and I created. Again, that runs on classical computers, but it represents quantum information, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of a representational thing. And we tried that synthesis out on that system, and it was really amazing. It was interesting. Just to give you an idea, I can link those sound files later, but
absolutely.
It was almost like it had a built-in reverb to
interesting.
it. And what we were doing was putting in classical inputs into a system, and it's called a variational quantum oscillator. You put classical inputs in, and you drive those, and you get hundreds of outputs or many outputs. So that was my first foray into what quantum computing could be when we have them. But it's still, we're at that interesting early stage where we can develop software over here, but we don't necessarily have the hardware yet to run it.
That is so interesting. It almost feels, to someone who is, a total outsider to this world, that feels almost like the cart is before the horse. But it sounds like you're already getting important information and experience from those simulations.
Absolutely. Simulation, in a sense, is the way we understand information. And this is something that, Eduardo and I talked about recently, that you can learn a lot from just thinking differently about a problem. And that's very much where simulation and the software being written around simulation matters. But that said, we're starting to get to a point where quantum computers are solving some kind of problems. There's specific problems in random number generation. There's a company out of Spain that's a spin out of ICFO that does quantum random number generation. We use that as our final concert at ICFO. And it was fun. I mean, is it human perceivable? Probably not, but it's there. And you're starting to see big companies like IBM and Microsoft and others start to actually solve problems with quantum systems. But to call it like a quantum computer is very much kind of open debate in the community.
Fascinating. So I want to take a step back and return to something really interesting you said, Spencer, about early synthesis using transistors, and sort of the different directions you talked about in where we are now with quantum music thinking and creation. And you mentioned both the sort of the synthesis, the sort of basic, like, how do I make a sound with this approach, and the composing side. And it felt like with early synthesizers, those two things were just like informing each other left and right, and have really laid the groundwork for a lot of contemporary music, even of the most popular kind and of the most sort of exploratory kind. I'm wondering, how does that feel, that relationship between, gut bucket synthesis of sound and composition feel with quantum? Are there any differences? Are there any nuances that really excite you as an artist?
It's an interesting and really challenging question. I actually love it. I think a lot of those were discussed at ICFO in some of our panel sessions. That's my first reaction. I think there's a third party in this problem, which is maybe a little different from early sound synthesis, is sort of the science community and what they hope to get out of this kind of work. And I know there's a real need, a concern, fear about misinformation about what quantum is, and in the science community, and how do we better communicate what we do. And that was really Florian's, I would say, one of his main missions with forming the artist residency at YQI at Yale Quantum Institute was, let's teach the public in a better, more effective way what these technologies are. I remember at one talk, it was a public talk that we gave as part of the Arts and Ideas Festival in New Haven. A guy, just a general, public member, audience member, stood up and he said, "Hey guys, I have a question for Spencer and his physicist guy," or something like, was this physicist and his physicist. I love that. I still call Kyle my physicist. So
you're lucky. Not every artist gets their own physicist,
right? I don't know if Kyle likes that, but
so
he said,
stood up and asked.
So this gentleman stood up and said, "Hey, I have a question for Spencer and a physicist. With these quantum computers, are they going to open up a black hole and consume the Earth and so on?" And I just didn't know what to say. I was like, and I just said, look, there's a lot of misrepresentations about what quantum is. Absolutely no black hole's going to open up if you run a quantum computer. And a lot of times scientists misrepresent, fairly to their credit, they misrepresent or over-exaggerate or miscontextualize things that are really important. Like certain types of effects might occur, but they're on such a small scale that it would never affect the rest of the universe. So I think some of things are like taken out of context that way. I think that combined in quantum with things like quantum healing and quantum medicine, there's all this.
When the shamans start to come into the conversation, that maybe you've gotten steered a little bit away from the basic science. Right.
So I think there's this real need. There's this kind of other piece, which is like, how do we address misinformation or misrepresentation? And, part of our mission with Physical Synthesis as a company is to bring people closer to experience and understanding things. And so to go back to your point about, or your question about, how does composition or ideas-based kind of representational work, such as composing, relate to sound synthesis? And I think what I see is that we're looking at kind of how these things relate to each other all the time. Like the conference was made up of people doing both. And I was very keenly listening to how they were talking about their work because I wanted to better understand the work I was doing. And so, one thing that's really difficult about quantum mechanics is that you almost have to erase everything you know about the way the world is supposed to work. Like all the Newtonian physics go out the door, and you just kind of have to retrain your mind a bit to think conceptually and really understand on some level, like that this is a different phenomenon. It occurs in this context only, in a subatomic context only. And you have to be okay with that. And so I think we're dealing with something that's very hard to see, very hard to intuit. So anything that kind of helps us better understand that, whether it's kind of a representation or a sonification, is good.
So the core hardware doesn't exist yet. So we don't really have a fully functioning quantum computer. But as we mentioned a few minutes ago, Eduardo Miranda has some really interesting controllers, and you in physical synthesis have built interesting sort of intersections between virtual and physical experiences. Anyway, I want to ask you, what kind of controllers are people using? How are people demonstrating or manipulating these systems that they're setting up? What kind of interesting hardware stuff is coming out of this that might apply more generally, not just to quantum music making?
So the device you're talking about has to do with a model of a qubit.
Thank you for explaining it, because I was just like, whoa, I don't think I could explain it. I was like, what is that? That's so cool. So go on, Spencer.
No, so it's okay. So two things. One, the hardware does exist, but it's in development. Okay. So to be really clear, we have systems that have many qubits now, or chips that have qubits. We have different kinds. There's not just one kind. There's like trapped ion. There's light-based or laser-based systems. There's people trying to make circuit boards with these things. So there's a whole range of different, like a whole ecosystem of possible contenders for what a qubit could be made out of. So it is, the stuff does exist. And in a similar way, the transistor went through a bumpy road to becoming the modern, IC or the, embedded processor. So just with that said, in terms of control, I think that's an interesting question. So I could see, I think we're like almost too early to tell.
Okay.
Yeah. I think people, like, for instance, we used like basic, Ableton, launch pads to do stuff. It needed a way to like activate stuff. Yeah. I saw one artist at ICFO that had like a light table that he was using. So he's using like infrared to kind of control stuff. So that was a cool analogy. With Miranda, they were using these kind of rings to rotate and move the qubit and spin. So it's kind of like you set in a position and then you compute some values out of it. And that actually like would query an actual quantum system, and then you get an answer back, and then that becomes a sound synthesis parameter state for your synth, so you can then play some music. So conceptually, that's very cool.
Yeah, it is.
But I would say we're a little early to tell if there's any kind of interfaces yet. Then we'll be like, that's an interface.
I got you. That's really good to know. So what are your aims, having experimented with these different quantum approaches? what do you hope to achieve as an artist moving forward? Or was that like, this is really fun and it was great experimentation, but I kind of want to head in a different creative direction? Do you have any sort of artistic goals that you've set after experimenting?
Well, I would say that there's kind of like two sets of goals. I have one set of goals as an artist and then one set of goals as a technologist or an instrument designer.
Yeah.
I think on the instrument design side, I'm really fascinated with this idea of there's something called quantum machine learning, but how that might be applied to signal processing and how we might be able to, I would say, conceivably anyway, synthesize at much higher resolutions a set of parameters for, say, speech synthesis or sound synthesis of instruments. So because of the way these systems work and this idea of, entanglement being applied and these kind of spaces, I think you're going to see more effective sound synthesis tools eventually. And I would love to be involved in that process. And I'm kind of still trying to figure out what that means, again, since we don't have the hardware yet. We don't have the computer yet. Or if we do, it's like super expensive. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, on that side of it, I think there's still a lot more just groundwork to be laid in quantum sound synthesis. And there are some people working on that. I'm participating in some projects where hopefully that leads to some things. Sound spatialization, I think, can greatly benefit from quantum algorithm processing, speed, and things like computing things like phase, frequency, location. So I think there's a great opportunity there. And then I think artistically, I just want to have more time, maybe have more time to make art, I guess.
I feel you.
I guess artistically, I really want to see more artists have access to these technologies. And it's one thing for like a small few people to have the opportunity to do it. It's another thing to like be able to give it to all the different artists that we've worked with on Cicada. I would love like, say, Etienne, or as it goes, Mason, have the opportunity to use these systems. What he would do with this, or Ben Jordan, or Andrew Huang. It would be amazing to bring some of these artists in and say, what could you do with this?
And there are people all over the world, if the interface was accessible enough, who could probably contribute some really interesting thoughts and feelings and ideas to the mix as well. It's like, it's exciting to be at the beginning of this new sound and music creation technology.
Yeah, we really are at the beginning. And, I immediately think of Max Matthews and, what he did to create, the first computer music. It's very much a kind of nostalgia for me, if you will. Like, it really does feel like a moment, and it's something we all talked about in Spain. And the next event that's relating to, I'll share that with you as well. ISQ CMC in Berlin will happen October 5th and 6th at the Intercontinental Hotel, and that'll be the next conference that's about quantum computing and music creativity. So, I'd like to see more activity here and see more participation.
Fantastic. Well, this has been a really great whirlwind tour of quantum music making. We're going to have a quick break, and then we're going to come back and talk more about physical synthesis and some of the great stuff you're doing there.
Okay. We heard you. We're keeping those early bird tickets open for a little while longer. You can still get that special rate of $249 for a ticket to the Music Tectonics Conference, but don't hesitate. Early birds will be gone for good after Tuesday, August 22nd. If you've been to other music industry conferences, you know that this rate is a sweet deal for 3 days, packed with conversation and connection with the top leaders and thinkers in music and tech. We are all gathering October 24th, 25th, and 26th by the beach in Santa Monica, California, for insightful keynotes, high-energy panels, intensive networking, and lots of opportunities to get business done. Don't wait to get your early bird ticket at musictectonics.com. It's your last chance. And while you're there, see who's on our speaker roster and what we have planned for ticket holders at the online pre-conference September 13th. I hope I will see you there.
And we're back. Hello, Spencer. Thanks for walking us through quantum music making. I hope everyone's minds have been blown, and that, your quantum healing has commenced. Sorry, I had to. the temptation to go on like an anti-quantum woo rant will be resisted. Let's go, and I want to talk to you about some of your other projects that are things that people can see, hear, and touch. So last time you were on the podcast, I think it was part of one of our NAMM episodes, we heard a lot about physical synthesis and your unique Cicada acoustic synthesizer. What's next? What are you guys working on now?
Yeah, so right now we're working on two projects that would interest this audience. One is called Nymph, which is a Eurorack module. And
yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. What are those? Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah. So Nymph is basically, the name references like a adolescent cicada. It's like insects are nymphs,
yeah.
right?
I thought it was that rather than like some sort of woodland sprite.
Yeah, I mean, we've got that too, but in this case, we're talking about the adolescent insects. So we had an idea to create Nymph, which is a Eurorack version of cicada. So a lot of our customers were like, could you guys just make something smaller that I can transport?
Yeah.
Because it's a bit of a schlep. You know, you're carrying around this case and all this stuff, and people might not have the setup. And one of the really cool features in this new version that we're about to release is an ability to raise and lower the stepper motor through a signal, or the soundboard rather, raise and lower the soundboard through a signal via a stepper motor. And the idea there is that you can just now autonomously run Cicada, but as a Nymph version. So that's going to be really cool. And then, you know, I think the fact that we got it to run in a Eurorack is kind of miraculous because, you know, things like transducers and other things can be kind of power hogs. So yeah, we really went out of our way to like make this achievable. The second project we're working on, which I don't know how much I can say, but we're working on a satellite project. We're going to be putting a synth in space.
Oh, great. I mean, I've seen the pictures of the cats with synths in space.
Yeah, no, this is an actual synthesizer in space. It'll be in a low.
That is amazing. Yeah. Like a low Earth orbit type. So Absolutely. We'll be able to look up and watch the synth fly by.
Exactly. Yes.
I know you can't go too deep into this yet, and I completely understand if you can't answer this question. But why? Why would you do that? Besides, I mean, it's really cool, but why?
I mean, why not?
So, I mean, it's in some ways. I've heard of everyone. I've heard of experimental composers using, say, like, you know, the internet network as an instrument, like using latency and other qualities of the network to play music, like. And I'm wondering, are you playing low Earth orbit satellites, or is it just the synth is going to sit up there, or is that getting too?
No, we can go into more detail. So what we've created is an instrument that can only work in space. It uses zero gravity. So.
What? Yeah. That's insane. I love it.
So it's relatively simple this time. We didn't go crazy. It's literally a small marble. The project's called Blue Marble, and it gets released from this like kind of marble catch into this kind of chamber. It's a pressurized chamber. And as it moves around and floats around, those generate control signals, which then we can use for music synthesis on Earth.
That's so fucking cool. I love it.
So secondly, we've also put in we're working with a company called U-Sound out of Germany. And they've created a MEMS speaker, and we have a small microphone. So you can actually play sound in this capsule. And so that's really going back to something I said earlier in the interview, you know, there's this idea of bringing people closer to experience. And, you know, there's a lot of misconceptions about what space is and what, you know, we have flat earthers, right? Like, so how do we help people feel closer to these technologies? And I think the reason we're doing it is that, you know, there's so many science initiatives in space, and I would say so few humanistic, artistic, arts and humanities initiatives in space, that this is an opportunity to kind of point us to that direction. Like, we need to do more in space that is relevant to people's lives, because if it isn't, nobody cares. Like, okay, so you did some strange experiment up there, but how does that relate to how I feel today or what I did? Yeah. So that's why we're really doing it, is to like bring people closer to the phenomenon of what it means to be in space.
That is really cool and really intriguing, and I can't wait to hear what that sounds like. So, you know, with these inventive music products, What's the relationship, sort of to get back to a complicated and somewhat convoluted question I asked you about quantum music? You make these music products and you're also a composer and artist. How does the technologist and artist, what kind of conversation do they have? What's their duet like? How does inspiration come when you have this interesting conversation between those two parts? I mean, honestly, they're the same part of a human, I would argue, but they can have really curious interplay, and I think it can be quite individual. How does it feel for you?
I would say, I'll just refer back to Cicada. When we built that, I didn't really know I had never released a commercial music product, right? So, or attempted to. And I think, the one really surprising outcome was the satisfaction I felt from other people playing, loving, and creating music on an instrument that I made. So that was a very new feeling. I think up to that point, I used instruments. I mean, I'm a violinist by training, and I placed a little bit of piano because I had to as a composer. But for me, I never thought of making or inventing a device that then somebody would find satisfaction and musicality in. So to me, that's really where these intersect. And I think with Blue Marble and some of the other tools we'll be releasing relative to the quantum projects, it's about that same feeling. It's I'm curious to see what you'll do with it. That's where this intersects for me. It's there's still an audience. It's just they're consuming and using the product that I make in a different way. Artistically, people listen to it and have affinity to it, and then become a fan of your work, you hope, or not, and who knows. But and then and then on the technology side, it's a similar thing, but it's how they're seeing themselves in this thing and finding a way to express themselves. So amazing.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Spencer, and for tolerating my noob questions. There's so much here to unpack, and I'm really grateful you gave us such a great introduction to this really exciting field.
Yeah, and I apologize to all the quantum engineers and quantum scientists out there. I hope I didn't misrepresent quantum technology in the wrong way. I did the best I could.
It's not Spencer, it's the interviewer. Please send me all your strongly worded emails. And I'm happy to be corrected. I'd love to learn more. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Music Tectonics. If you like what you hear, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app. We have new episodes for you every week. Did you know we do free monthly online events that you, our lovely podcast listeners, can join? Find out more at musictectonics.com. And while you're there, look for the latest about our annual conference and sign up for our newsletter to get updates. Everything we do explores the seismic shifts that shake up music and technology, the way the Earth's tectonic plates cause quakes and make mountains. Connect with Music Tectonics on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. That's my favorite platform. Connect with me, Dmitry Vitsa, if you can spell it. We'll be back again next week, if not sooner.
You're listening to Music Tectonics.